One thing that I think makes Wooden Sleepers work is that regardless of your personal style, these kind of American staples can work for you.
What is your name and what do you do? We'll start from the basics.
Love it. My name is Brian Davis, and I run Wooden Sleepers, a vintage shop based in Westchester, New York.
Well, and where are we at right now?
We are at Wooden Sleepers. This space is part showroom, it's part office, it's part shipping facility, it's part photo studio, and recently part retail store. Did I say that already?
Tell me, what is Wooden Sleepers?
Wooden Sleepers started back in 2010, and the original concept was to have a curated men's vintage store that focused on kind of the greatest hits of American menswear: military, workwear, Ivy, and outdoors clothing. And over the past 14 years, we haven't really deviated from that too much. I think the assortment has been refined, the brand has been elevated to a certain extent, but the core idea has not wavered.
And what about that era of menswear drew you to it?
Well, I was always interested in vintage clothing. Even from a really young age, I was gravitating towards thrift stores, secondhand clothing, flannels from my grandfather's closet. There was something about having an accessible entry point into personal style that was really appealing to me. Because as a kid, I didn't have limitless amounts of money to go explore my personal tastes. I had, the money I made raking leaves after school in my pocket. But that went a long way at a thrift store, because at the time, you could get t-shirts or old jeans, denim jackets, work shirts for, $1, $2, $3. So it was a really approachable way to start to express myself through clothing.
So you've always been in the vintage world.
I think so, and I'm not going to front like my personal style was this perfectly conceived, rounded out thing, when I was 13 years old. It wasn't, but I was always aware of what I was wearing. That was always important to me, even from a very young age. I was the kind of kid that was thinking about what they were going to wear to school the next day, laying it out on the bed. And when I put the right thing together, I felt like $1,000,000. It kind of made me confident and gave me a little pep in my step. So by the time I was able to start buying clothes for myself, I came of age in the kind of like the early 90s, and I was really drawn to like alternative culture, counterculture, whether that was like skateboarding, hip hop, alternative music. So my personal style was kind of an amalgamation of all three of those worlds. And that's how I wanted to dress. And I found that like being able to dress that way was much more attainable shopping secondhand, because that's what I saw. People like, Kurt Cobain, or like, Jamie Thomas in like the CS catalog, or like, whoever, Cypress Hill or something, these like all these kind of cultural icons and figures at the time, I felt like really informed my personal style and where my tastes were going. And I still reference that stuff even to this day.
And obviously there's a big difference though between being just an enthusiast of an industry and maybe wanting to go into business, making
Right.
that your full-time career. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that decision to take that passion into your work.
Yeah, so here's a funny story. When I was 18, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool to have a vintage clothing store? And I remember I saw a poster in an empty storefront in Port Jefferson on Long Island, and I said, oh, even at 18, I thought, oh, that might be a cool place to open a vintage clothing store, because it's next to Stony Brook University and college kids like vintage clothing. So I'm like developing this kind of informal business plan in my head, and getting a feel for the market and where things might work where I was from. Of course, I didn't have any money. I didn't have any knowledge. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I had no resources. So this was just a dream. This was something I was exploring. And I remember even going to Borders sitting on the floor with the Idiot's Guide to Starting a Small Business and like reading through this thing of like, okay, this is all well and good, but I can't do this right now, you know? And it took almost an entire decade before that kind of dream was realized. Life took me in a completely different direction. I had a whole other career throughout my 20s and early 30s before deciding to start Wooden Sleepers. Um, the decision to start Wooden Sleepers was really, I would say, around 2010. I had a job, I had a whole nother career, and I was just like looking for something fun to do. My girlfriend at the time, my wife now, she said, well, you love vintage men's clothing. Why don't you start an online store for vintage menswear? At the time in 2010, that was kind of a novel concept. You know, that didn't really exist. You could buy vintage clothing on eBay, and that was really it. But that was like the Wild West. Otherwise, you know, you had specialty vintage men's stores in Japan. You had maybe a handful in the States that did not sell online. They were very much like, if you know, you know, insidery, you know, hidden kind of for people in the know. So this idea of taking like a tight curated edit of vintage menswear and putting it online in 2010, you know, that was kind of a novel concept. And because of that, I think it picked up steam right away because this was at the height of like the menswear, blogging, internet bubble that was happening at that moment. So you had like all these bloggers, all these websites, all these message boards. People were talking about menswear online. You know, Twitter had been around for a couple of years. Tumblr had just started. Instagram had just started. So now you've got these social networks, plus these forums, plus these blogs, and there's this whole ecosystem, right, to support something like this. So when I came out in 2010, it was like there was already an audience for this just waiting because people were really interested in this, like, you know, books like Take Ivy and like this sort of classic like Americana type of clothing was having a real moment. Not just in like the menswear community, but like in culture at large, I think. And yeah, we just caught a wave. We just caught a wave. Sorry, that was like a really long tangent, but like that, you know, I think that zeroing in on like that moment is really relevant because had we started a couple of years early, there might not have been the audience for it. And starting a couple of years later, well, it might have seemed late to the party. But for some reason, starting in 2012, 2010 was very serendipitous.
Talk about launching in 2010. What was the inventory? Was it just stuff that you accumulated? Was it your own wardrobe? What was that initial, I guess, inventory that you sold in 2010?
Yeah, so I had already been shopping for vintage clothing for myself for so many years. I started shopping for vintage when I was in sixth grade. You know, so all through middle school, high school, college, I was always wearing vintage clothing. The idea of selling vintage clothing, it hadn't really crossed my mind because in order to sell vintage clothing, you either had to have a store or be a vendor at like a flea market or something. And, you know, that just wasn't particularly interesting to me. And having a store seemed, you know, unattainable at that point in my life. So by the time 2010 rolls around, you've got Etsy, right? Brand new website. You know, don't want to like give them a huge plug here, but I think the interesting thing about Etsy at the time was it was this kind of young, new thing focused on handmade and vintage, which is very unique, right? So it's much more focused than say like eBay, which felt like the Wild West, where you could literally buy anything. Etsy felt like, okay, here's a place it's plug and play. We can set it up really easily. We take some pictures, put it up, write the descriptions, and we're off to the races. It's a marketplace, so there's already people there. It's not like I have to build my own website and then try to figure out how to get people there. It's like there are already people there. So, you know, in terms of getting the inventory together for our initial offering, that was really fun because for so many years I had been limited to buying things that fit me and things that I really liked. And I would pass over things where I was like, okay, well, that's too big or too small. But now all of a sudden I could say, well, I love that. It doesn't matter what size it is because it's going to fit somebody as long as it's really great. Let's get it. Let's offer it up. And the funny thing is, like, I have screenshots of my old Etsy store from 2010, and it's strikingly similar to what I'm offering in 2024. I think the 2024 version is a little more refined. It's a little bit, the point of view has sharpened, but the basic idea and things that I was gravitating towards at that time are still the things I'm gravitating towards today. So it's been really cool for me to just like ride it out in spite of all the trends that come and go in menswear and in vintage. I've decided, like, you know what? I'm just going to keep doing what I do. And if people are into it, they're going to keep coming back. And I feel like for me, consistency and reliability and not shifting gears every time there's a new trend in menswear has really afforded me this great, this like ability to keep running this business year over year. It's funny, like 2010, you had the heritage moment, right? And then all of a sudden everybody's dressing like Italian grandfathers in like beautiful Neapolitan suiting. And then everyone's going into like streetwear. And then it's like athletic wear. And then it's all these different things. And that whole time I was like, this is what we're doing. This is what Wooden Sleepers is. And maybe it was because I started it a little bit later. I'd already kind of like zeroed in on my personal style and what I liked by that point. So it was easy for me to be stubborn and be like, okay, you want to go do the Italian thing? Do that. You want to go do the streetwear thing? Do that. Like, I appreciated it all. I think people look great doing it. But for me and for my business, it was much more important to say, like, no, this is who we are. It's a brand. It's not just a vintage clothing store. It's something that people will recognize and should feel similar year over year when they come in. Or else they're going to be like, what the hell? Like, last year I came here, you were selling vintage LL Bean, and now you're selling Nikes. Like, what's going on? It's like, I think there's room for all those things. And one thing that I think makes Wooden Sleepers work is that regardless of your personal style, these kind of American staples can work for you. Whether you're like the heritage guy, whether you're that sort of tailored traditional menswear guy, whether you're like the streetwear leaning guy, I think there's a place for this stuff in your wardrobe.
And how are you discerning which piece comes into the shop and which doesn't? Is it more of a feeling? Is it more of an art, or is it more of a science? Where it's like it's got to fit this certain time period, this certain vintage. It's got to do. How do you make the cut essentially?
Yeah, so I'll say this, like, I'm not a collector, and I've never been like analytical about this stuff. It's all gut, it's all feeling, it's all emotion, right? Like, if I see something and it makes my heart speed up a little bit, that's the indicator. Like, if I really love it, if I want to wear it, if it's something that I think is really unique, really special, I'm going for it. So often I think with menswear and in vintage menswear, people get hung up on the details and lose sight of the big picture, the big feeling, right? They'll say, well, this is so rare. This little detail makes this so rare. Okay, but are you gonna wear it? Does it matter? Like, maybe the less rare piece is the better piece for you, right? So I've never been in the collectibles business. Like, that's not my business. I'm a retailer. So what gets me going is when somebody comes in, finds something they love, and it's an approachable price point, something that is not so astronomically expensive and rare that they feel like they can't wear it. Like, I want people to put this stuff on and be like, wow, this feels amazing. I can't wait to go wear this. I'm not so interested in the piece that needs to be like preserved in a display case or some archive or hung on a wall somewhere. Like, these are clothes, right? I appreciate if something's really rare and really valuable. Obviously, you're not just going to go wear that, but that's not really where my business is. I'm much more interested in like wearing clothes and enjoying clothes and how the right piece of clothing can make you feel. And I've always loved that. And that's the part of retail that's really magic, is when, especially with this kind of stuff, where you can't just say, give me that jacket in a medium. Okay, no, we only have one. So if that particular piece happens to work for you and it's a perfect fit and it's like the vibe is right, that's like magic. Because I feel like, what are the odds of some like random person coming in here and finding something they really love, it happens to fit them perfectly, it looks great on them, and they can afford it and they can wear it out that day? Like, though, that is all magic to me, because there's a lot of steps that need to occur for that to happen. So it's always really special when you find when the person finds the right piece. You know, you feel like you're kind of connecting dots in a way.
But going back to that, can you recall the instant, maybe one or two instances specifically of that happened, and how that maybe made you feel from a shop owner, and how that piece of clothing made the patron feel walking out of the store with it?
Yeah, so I closed my stores in Red Hook in 2020 during COVID, and I didn't know that I was never going to have those stores again. Like, we just closed one day, March 20th. It was a Sunday. I showed up for work. Like any other Sunday, we did our business. I closed up that night, and then the governor of the state of New York said, okay, all non-essential businesses are shutting down. So Monday comes around. Okay, well, I guess we're closed for now. And there was this kind of air of uncertainty. And I remember posting something to our Instagram at that time, like, okay, well, maybe we'll see you in a week or two. I didn't know that I was never going to open those stores again. I didn't know that like event was going to completely change my life and the direction of my business. I just didn't know. And so to fast forward to 2024, we only just started opening up to the public again. I was essentially running this space as a private showroom. So we would run our e-commerce business here, we would have private appointments, but I had not opened up to the public since 2020. I only just started opening up to the public a couple weeks ago. Saturdays, 12 to 5, we are open to the public, no appointment necessary. And that felt like such a monumental moment for me that I don't think anybody would think that was a big deal or cares or would understand like the significance that had to me personally and to the business. But I always wanted to have a shop. That was my dream. And to have to close under those circumstances was completely heartbreaking. Now, the part that people don't always see was running a store is really difficult. It's really hard, and it will suck every last bit of energy you have to give it. It's a black hole. And unless you are really disciplined and create very strong boundaries, that store will suck you dry. And I think by the end of it, I was not in a great place. The store, I was there all the time. My daughter had just been born. I was getting home late. She'd already be asleep. I was commuting like all these hours a day. It was like not great. I was sitting around this shop like waiting for people to come in, maybe spend some money. And it was just taking so much time, so much resources, so much energy. So, looking back on it, closing was actually maybe like the best thing that ever happened to me and happened to the business, because I was so married to it. I loved it so much that I would have never walked away from it. I needed to be forced to walk away from that. And we had a great run. I am so proud of that time we had. It was 2014 to 2020. Like, we had people visit from all over the world. We became a fixture of the neighborhood. We were a destination within New York City for like menswear lovers, vintage lovers, people in the fashion industry, celebrities, like you name it. Like, we really became like that beacon, that gathering place for people who were into that stuff. And it was amazing. We had like so much good fortune. Like the New York Times wrote about us, GQ wrote about us, New York Magazine gave us like Best of New York. Like anywhere I could have possibly wanted to be written about, we were written about. So I'm incredibly proud and grateful for that time. But this era, from like 2020 till now, it feels so much healthier and so much more sane. I can walk home in 5 minutes. My daughter, and now I have a son, they come over here and play hide and seek while I'm packaging orders. Like I'm home for dinner. And lo and behold, the business is actually healthier now that we've shifted our focus to online appointments. And now we have this little open hours time every Saturday where I get my retail fix, right? So it's a full circle moment where we're opening the doors. You never know who's going to come in. And it's been completely awesome to meet people from the neighborhood. I'm still like a little New York City centric because that's where I operated my business for so many years, that I was thinking, okay, we're going to open up to the public and people from the city are going to come up. But that is not what happened at all. And the pleasant surprise of all this has been there is this cool guy in Westchester who has come out. And it's been great because you know what? There's no place else to shop up here. So for me to get to meet people in the community and in some of the neighboring towns, villages, you know, it's been awesome. It's been awesome. And I'm so looking forward to continuing to be open to the public on Saturdays and have that little concentrated window where people know like, hey, we can go down there. There's no pressure. It's light. You pop in. If you want to buy something, you can. If you want to hang out, you can. The stakes are so much lower and it's just fun. It's just a great vibe.
Wow. And
yeah.
That's incredible. Was there a moment in that time period between when you closed and when you reopened that you thought maybe I'm not gonna have a retail space anymore?
Yeah, it was kind of a transitional time because when I first closed my stores in Red Hook, I thought, okay, I'll open another store. That is what my plan was. But as time went on and I found this space, and this space started to develop and kind of get a life of its own, I realized, well, maybe having another store in New York City is not what I really want or what I need. And maybe this is the spot. And I think that's been the biggest learning of all of this, was just kind of being nimble and the willingness to like stay the course but like take some detours along the way, because the brand is essentially the same, the inventory is the same, the shop is kind of the same, but the way that I'm operating it is so much different. And maybe from the outside looking in, it's not different. And maybe that's a good thing. I think obviously there are people who are like, okay, well, you're not in New York City anymore. That's a big difference. But you know what? I was in Red Hook. Red Hook was annoying to get to also. So it's like me being up here in Tuckahoe, just like a small little historic village in Westchester, I don't feel like is entirely off brand for me because I was never like the Nolita guy anyway. I was never the Soho guy anyway. So for me, it was all about that little destination and just kind of doing it my way.
I mean, the commute time is probably faster from Grand Central to here than it was to Grand Central to your store in Red Hook.
I've said that it's easier to get here than Red Hook. Granted, we don't have Sonny's Bar here and Hometown Barbecue, but, there's some other cool stuff. And I'm working on that. I think that was something that I was really passionate about being in Red Hook, was being an advocate for the community and really trying to be part of that small business community and helping to like lure people there, not just for my own business, but for the neighboring businesses as well. And, that's something I feel like I have some work to do here, saying, hey, like, yeah, come to Wooden Sleepers, but while you're here, here's a good cafe, here's a great shoe repair down the street, here's where you can get your hair cut, here's a good lunch spot. And just being an advocate for the community is really important to me. And, that's something like I always pushed and tried to raise awareness about what was going on in Red Hook, and I'm hoping to do the same here. It's a little tougher sell, but there's some great stuff happening here, and you just need a car.
Yeah. I'd love to hear your perspective on the state of vintage right now.
The state of vintage right now is that it's more popular than ever. It has reached a fever pitch like I've never seen before, and I think that there's some contributing factors to that. I feel like, gosh, when I was a kid, shopping in thrift stores was not exactly a cool thing, right? This was at the height of like Abercrombie and, this kind of aspirational fashion, Polo, Tommy Hilfiger. So the idea of shopping in thrift stores was like not exactly cool. I did it because I wanted to express myself and I was interested in it. But for most people, I would say they were not interested in secondhand clothing. They were not interested in vintage clothing. Now it's completely different. And I think there's some factors that are contributing to that. I think the younger generation is burnt out on fast fashion. They see like, hey, this is not great for the environment. This type of consumption is problematic. They're asking questions about, where is my clothing made? What's happening to it after I'm done wearing it? Why does it fall apart after a couple wears? And so these questions are leading people to vintage or secondhand in one way or another. I think vintage and secondhand is now cool, right? It's, a younger generation saying, hey, this stuff is unique. It's got, it's distinctive. It will allow me to sort of express myself as an individual and not just wear the same thing that everyone else is wearing. This whole movement of like repairing and mending your clothing is having a big moment right now. Upcycling. So, hey, can I patch something up? Can I fix it myself? This is a movement that's happening right now. We're hosting mending workshops here where you can bring your favorite vintage piece in and we'll teach you how to repair it. And this is not to say like these are going to be perfect repairs, but that's the fun of it, is to kind of make an art out of it. And it's a little messy and it gives a little character, but learning to embrace those imperfections and get a second life for the garment, that is all having a moment. Upcycling is having a moment, like taking something from your closet that you haven't worn in a year, and it's like, well, maybe I'll cut the sleeves off and put a different sleeve on, or swap the pocket, or mess with it a little bit to make it feel new again. These are all things that are having a moment, and that's just like the end user, right? That's just the person who's like, hey, I'm going to buy vintage because I like it, or I'm going to fix something because it needs to be fixed and I want to keep wearing it. The vintage business is also bigger than it's ever been before. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, not just like vintage, but secondhand used clothing. Massive, massive industry, right? And so you've got everything from like hyper curated niche vintage stores like Wooden Sleepers, and then you've got massive stores the sizes of like supermarkets just selling inexpensive secondhand clothes from the last 10 years. Like, would people consider those vintage or valuable? Not necessarily, but people are flocking to those places in droves because it's inexpensive and it's unique and it's a little something different than they would just find at their local H&M or Forever 21. And in some cases it's cheaper. So, the whole world has just exploded. And then forget even like this whole world of like online vintage selling is now just like more popular than ever. I think that was really like a COVID phenomenon too, where everyone was home, and kids that were maybe formerly like waiting online at Supreme to buy stuff and flip it, well, then they discovered like vintage wrap tees. Oh, well, I can collect these have value all of a sudden. Now I'm going to sell that. And then that same kid is, oh, well, now I'm discovering other vintage things that are interesting. Maybe it's vintage denim, maybe it's vintage workwear, maybe it's vintage militaria. So now you've got this like whole new generation of people who are like growing up in this world of trading, buying, selling, flipping. The vintage marketplace is ripe for that type. If you're interested in that sort of thing, like, of course you're going to be gravitating towards this world, because that whole like nature of like getting out there, finding something and then flipping it, that's the whole business. That's the whole world. And I think that like I've observed this whole new generation of people getting into this, like it's just exploded. It's just exploded, you know. And there were people, I'm sure there were people who thought that like when I came out in 2010, like, oh, there's this like new, like younger guy doing this in sort of this different way, like using some of these tools in a slightly different way. And now it's like the same thing. Like, whereas maybe like I was posting, it's so funny. Like back in the day, there used to be like signs in vintage stores that were like no photos, right? Because the owners thought like fashion designers were going in and taking pictures of clothing to bring back to their studios to like copy the piece without buying it, right? So that was like a valid concern. Now the idea of like, fast forward to like 2010, when I opened my store, it was like, no, please take photos and post them and share them and tell all your friends. You know what I mean? So it was this mentality shift. And now, 10, 12 years later, you've got TikTok, people doing these like, hey, here's my thrift haul. Here's what I got today. Get ready with me videos. Like, here's my vintage style. Here's how I put it together. And like, I'm here for all of that. Like, as somebody who still loves this stuff, I am very interested in like how the next generation is interacting with it and how they're putting it together and what their like tastes are and what they're interested in. And, hopefully I can be here as a resource to this next generation as like, okay, this person's been kind of in this game for a while. I have some knowledge of it and can offer like my perspective on it. But overall, like in terms of like the next generation, I'm just kind of like an observer of it. I think it's really interesting. And the last thing I'll say about like the vintage market is that brands are now paying attention, right? Big brands are saying, well, how do we get involved in this? Like, this is interesting. This is clearly like having a moment, this vintage clothing, secondhand clothing, repairing, mending, da da da. You see brands like Patagonia, they're offering like worn well, right? It's like, hey, bring us your old beat up Patagonia. We'll fix it up for you. Or we'll take it from you and give you a discount on a new piece, and then we'll fix it up and sell it. Smart, right? So this is a big brand applying the same sort of principles that like any vintage dealer is doing, right? Like buying something, fixing it up, selling it. That's the game, right? It's not rocket science, but to now see like bigger brands engaging with that it's awesome. I mean, it's really interesting that like they're wanting to kind of tap into that too, right? Because I think a lot of brands are trying to figure out like, well, how do we be more, how do we like tap in more to like youth culture, but also like appear more like environmentally conscious or just like with it, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I think vintage and secondhand, like, I don't know. I mean, I remember sitting around on my porch during COVID talking to my wife and saying like, why aren't more brands selling their own vintage? Maybe I could be somebody that could help with that. And then that brought my business in a totally different direction. Since closing my stores in Red Hook, I've done projects with Ralph Lauren, with J. Crew, with J. Press, with Brooks Brothers, with LL Bean, with Todd Snyder. And every single one of those projects had to do with vintage clothing and curating vintage clothing. And that's incredible. I mean, that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
Do you find that your customers come in and they buy into like your style, maybe it's like your personal style, and then by default, if this jacket or that shirt has gotten your seal of approval, then they're like, all right, it's cool because I like Brian's style. Do you find that? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't consider myself influential or an influencer or any of that stuff. I love clothes. I love vintage still. You know, I wear vintage clothing. I seek it out. So I feel like I'm like my customers. Like we're all into this stuff. Um, One thing that I've always tried to do with wooden sleepers is like if everybody is into something, like okay, case in point, it's I'm getting ready to open like my let me back up for a second. So I visited a lot of vintage stores over the years, and one thing that was always really frustrating for me was like, you know, seeing like the best stuff hung up on the walls and nothing was for sale, you know, or like the walls of vintage Levi's and leather jackets and like Western shirts. And, you know, I think that just like wasn't my taste. And I didn't feel like I needed to be that. You know, I felt like there was room for my own point of view and to make it really autobiographical, right? So stock the things that I loved that were referencing where I grew up on the North Fork of Long Island. Like it's this kind of coastal Atlantic, like rugged farmland, like there's people clamming in the bay, like that kind of like workwear. And I think that's where all that like vintage LL Bean stuff comes in. And that type of clothing, it wasn't exactly the kind of stuff you would find in your average vintage store in Soho or in Manhattan, you know, at that time. It was like all, you know, vintage jeans, leather jackets, t-shirts, and that was pretty much it. So, you know, one thing I've always tried to do is like, if everybody is over here, I kind of want to offer something a little bit different. So when I opened Wooden Sleepers, I said, the hell with jeans. We're not even going to stock jeans. I'm going to be like the chino guy. And I bring that up because that was at the height of like slim fit chinos. Like if you go back, you can't go back because it's not there anymore. But like I have a screenshot of my first Etsy shop in 2010. This was at the height of like low rise slim fit chinos. So for that period of time, like 2010, 11, 12, you know, Uniqlo, J. Crew, they're all pumping out these like slim fit skinny chinos. And I was like, no, this is the chino that you need. And it was a vintage 1950s, 1960s, full cut, high rise, big leg opening, like a 9-inch leg opening, a 12-inch front rise, tucked in t-shirt, like a classic fitting chino. I was like, this is the chino. And you know what's really funny about that? New York Magazine said we were the place to get the best vintage khakis. Just like such a funny accolade, right? That's like, okay, cool. Like, I'll put that on my business card, you know, best vintage khakis. But that was the point. It was like nobody was really doing that or putting an emphasis on it to say like, okay, here's where like all of menswear culture is over here. Let's show it in a different way. Let's show like, hey, maybe there's an alternative to that. And guys would come in one at a time and be like, I hear this is where you get the full cut khakis. And they would try them on and be like, okay, these feel huge. This feels ridiculous. Then over time, it started to move in that direction. And now you've got J. Crew selling a giant fit chino, right? And it's like, it's just funny how like the pendulum swings back and forth. And we see that all the time in menswear. But, you know, to kind of start advocating for those type of pieces that were maybe a little bit neglected or underappreciated or undervalued, that's what I feel like Wooden Sleepers' superpower is, right? Taking something that would otherwise be undervalued, underappreciated, wouldn't even get a second look, but providing it this context and saying, you know what, this is actually special and this is cool and here's why and here's how you can wear it. And I wear it myself to show people, or I put it on the mannequin to give people an example and paint the picture for them, then all of a sudden we're kind of creating our own little market for these products that would otherwise be completely undervalued. You know, you could say the same thing about like, you know, we started selling vintage Brooks Brothers Oxford cloth button-down shirts like in 2012 or something. You would never find that shirt in a vintage store at that time, ever. And then I'm watching as time goes on, people are like seeking them out. And they're picking up on all those little vintage details that I'm talking about. Like, okay, soft collar roll, the amount of buttons, the fabric, the hem, the cut, right? All of these things that we're promoting. And, you know, the best thing for me is when the current brand isn't doing it. Because then I can say, well, look at how much better the old one is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I love when brands don't do the thing that they should be doing, because it gives me a lane to say, well, here's why the 40-year-old one is actually better than the one that you could buy in the store today. And if I get enough guys to say, hey, I'm with you, right? Then all of a sudden I've created a little space for that product that maybe otherwise would have gone unnoticed or underappreciated. And that goes for like brands as well. Like, I just think in general, vintage stores were not, they did not care about like vintage outdoors brands or vintage like Gorpy brands, or, you know, these things that like I grew up around, like vintage LL Bean, vintage Land's End, Eddie Bauer, this kind of like vintage preppy stuff, this like New England aesthetic, this collegiate stuff. Like, everyone's Tumblr was filled with images of like Take Ivy and this like era of like kind of American, like clean cut type of style. 60s into the 70s, it got a little more rugged, the outdoorsy stuff came, but like that interest was not being reflected in any vintage stores that I was aware of. So that's where Wooden Sleepers really came in, was like taking this like energy around that world, right, of like Ivy style, kind of like rugged stuff, like a little workwear, a little military, but like mashing it all together, right, to try to like resemble that world, right? I think that was the unique thing. That was the thing that we were able to do a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people were noticing that. Speaking of accolades, you know, that you got one of the top GQ's top menswear stores in America. Talk a little bit about that and what that meant for maybe you personally and the business.
So in 2014, when we opened in Red Hook, GQ called us the best new vintage store in New York. That was incredible, right? They like posted they posted just like an iPhone picture of the inside of our store to their grid, right? Which is just so funny, because now you think about the way that like social media has developed, and like those grid posts are probably planned out weeks in advance, and there's like a team of people analyzing it, and like, here's what's gonna da 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 da. But then it was like still like a little casual, you know? It's like somebody just kind of snuck that in, like, hey, like just throw this up on the grid. So it's like, I'm just there. But even then, they had millions of followers. So it was like, that really elevated the brand. And people were coming in for 6 months to a year after that saying, hey, we saw you in GQ. And then fast forward to 2024, we're here in this little studio on the second floor in this little village in Westchester. And GQ says, hey, you're one of the 30 best vintage stores in the entire country. I was like, damn, that feels really good. That feels really good, because like I didn't even fully identify as a store, you know, or just like the nature of a store has kind of evolved, right? It's like this idea that you have to be on the street, open 7 days a week from 11 to 6, and have like sales associates, and like that idea of a store has kind of evolved, right? And I think that personally, like the best vintage stores in America are not even stores. They're like little art studios that are open by appointment, or someone's like public storage locker or someone's garage or someone's apartment. So this whole idea of like a store has really evolved. And I think the fact that like GQ acknowledges that, not overtly, but by saying, hey, this is one of the best vintage stores in America, and it's like not even a store, is pretty freaking cool. So I look, that stuff, it really does matter. It really does matter, especially for a small business. And I think it's really cool that they choose to shine a light on, like, they've always been supportive of wooden sleepers. So I'm here for it.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And kind of my final big question is, I'd love to talk a little bit about the collaborations that you mentioned. Obviously, you have the LB one that just came out, but you mentioned a great list of brands that you've collaborated with. I guess I'd love to hear about how those kind of come about and how you go working with these big heritage brands like LL Bean, like J Press.
Yeah, I mean, when I had my stores in Red Hook, I think I was complaining earlier that it was just like sucking up all my time and energy. I loved having a shop, but like the business of running a store, that was all consuming. Like keeping it merchandised, making sure it was clean, making sure it was staffed, making sure the customers were being taken care of. Like all of that added up to a 50, 60 hour a week work week, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of room for like other projects. With that said, I always wanted to work with brands. Like I always thought that would be cool because I'm obsessed with like American heritage brands. I'm interested in the longevity, the worlds that they've created, and I always felt like there was opportunity there, but I didn't have time to really explore it. So when we closed the shops during COVID, that was a time when I could finally like breathe and just start that process. So I made a list on my phone of all the brands I would want to work with. Pie in the sky, Ralph Lauren, top of the list, right? And we got the opportunity to work with them. And the cool thing about getting to work with Ralph first is no one else was going to say no after that, And I've been really, really lucky because once I had that one under my belt, then that sort of, I feel like one thing just led to the next, and it snowballed. And it gave me a little kind of portfolio to say like, hey, here's some things that we could do together. I think no two projects have been the same, but they've all been like really true to wooden sleepers. And I've been really lucky to get to put my point of view into these projects and into these collaborations, whether that's like sourcing, Todd Snyder was launching like a LL Bean collaboration in 2021. He said, hey, let's get a bunch of cool LL Bean vintage together and we'll, you can just kind of do your thing with it, like photograph it, source it, do the whole thing. And, that was like the first time I remember seeing a major fashion brand say, hey, let's do a vintage thing. Let's have a big vintage moment to support this like broader release that was happening. I had never seen that before. And I thought, this is really incredible that this is happening right now. And then, to be working with Bean a couple of years later on an ongoing basis and doing these kind of curated thematic vintage drops, it's a dream come true. And it's honestly like I feel so ready for it because I've been doing this for so long that now that these opportunities are happening, it's like, yeah, let's just make sure we're really knocking it out of the park. Like our first LL Bean drop sold out in one day. Our second one sold out in 1 hour, And so there's an appetite for this stuff too. And I think to have the right partners where it makes sense, it's like, it's not like I'm out here collaborating with like H&M. People would be like, okay, well, hopefully you got paid well for that. It wouldn't really make sense, but I've been really fortunate to get to work with brands that I really admire. And, I think a lot of it was that like my stores were based in New York and a lot of those brands were already clients of mine. So they were already shopping vintage for their own design teams. And so it wasn't a huge stretch to work on a project. And yeah, I mean, it's been incredible, and more to come. I mean, I don't know when this is airing, but we have 1, 2, 3 more drops with LL Bean this year alone. And then, yeah, more of that stuff to come.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
That's exciting. I guess we'll wrap on this, but what's next for Wooden Sleepers?
Well, I think we're in a really good place right now. The business is really healthy. I'm feeling really good about it. We've got our open hours every Saturday. We're doing appointments during the week. We have our online store. We do this great menswear market in New York City every month called Alfargo's. We've got this ongoing partnership with LL Bean, more drops coming there. And so, like, it's a little ecosystem, and it's feeling really good right now. Like, everything is firing on all cylinders. So I would just like to continue pushing all of that forward, which is really difficult as just a one-person brand. I actually recently hired somebody to help out with all this stuff, and he's been great. Shout out Will. And so, yeah, just more of the same. I think, my dream, and, if anybody out there is watching this and wants to help facilitate that, is to work on some actual collaborative Wooden Sleepers private label product. I think that's the next frontier, right? Because we've always done merch for the shop, like hats and t-shirts and bags and sweatshirts and stuff, but I would really love to get into some Wooden Sleepers cut and sew, but I feel like I need the right partner for that. So we'll see if anyone out there's listening.
Incredible.
Slide into the DMs.